All right, so you guys asked where is it working, Jill? We think so. Yeah. So, anyways, we'll figure out if the recording works. That's awesome. If not, I got to tweak it. But if you guys ever did want to read it, I'm just reusing the church's old YouTube. It's New Life Community Church, NACM. Just search that on YouTube, and our videos will start appearing on that. Because Doug and Gwen had already built a base of subscribers and videos on that, so I'm just using what they started, which is amazing. And so if you ever miss a sermon or you're away and you'd like to hear what we're doing, that's where they'll be, and I will tweak as we go. So we're continuing on our series on wrath, and Jill's giving me a really weird face. Yes, yeah, so it's going to be delayed, so yeah, it's not going to be immediately see what's going on with me. Yeah, no, don't worry. We're going to talk about wrath, and I just want to give you guys a little bit of a recap, and I think this is fun in the sense that I always have to remember what I preached on weeks ago. It's almost like a test. Maybe you guys can help me if I miss something, but the first week, talking about wrath, we talked about what is wrath in general, or what is God's wrath versus man's wrath. And we were talking that, it's simply put, God's wrath is divine justice, holy and righteous. He's combating, he's getting rid of the sin that is in this world and in our lives. While human wrath is usually wrapped up in emotions, personal gain, and vengeance, we really use the term of you're going to get what you deserve from my hands, right? If you push me, I'm going to push you back harder. If you punch me, I'm going to punch you twice, right? It's just that revenge tactic when we talk about wrath when it comes to humans. Next, we ask the question, is God just an angry God? Is he just someone up in the sky that just wants to harm us, just wants to send the lightning and strike us when we do something wrong? Is he ever happy, right? It's a question that we asked. And so we dove into the subject of that it's God hating sin. He's angry at sin. He's angry that he created us to have a relationship with him, and then sin came into this world and then divided us, separated us from him, something that he created us to have that relationship. And so when that's broken, of course, he's upset. Wouldn't we be upset at something like that as well? And so he's mad at sin that's separating us. He's not mad at you as a creation. He's not mad at you because it talks about in Jeremiah that you are, like, God knew you before you were created in the womb, right? He knows you. He knows the hairs on your head, right? So if he knows all this stuff, he obviously cares about you. But it's the sin that resides inside of us that he hates. And so his justice is against the sin that we harbor and not against us as humans, just for being a human. And then last week, we looked at the story of David and the prophet Nathan. And we told the story that David had committed multiple sins when he lusted after Bathsheba on that roof, right? She ended up getting pregnant, and then David goes to try to cover up his sin by getting Uriah to come home from the front lines and try to, have them have relations so that it covers up what David did. But Uriah was like, no, I don't want to leave the battle. I'm fighting for our nation. I'm going back. And so David said, well, if he's not going to come and listen to what I said, I'm going to have him killed. And so he has Uriah killed on the front lines to cover his sins. And then Nathan comes to him 9 months later after this whole situation, and he tells a story about of a man who has a lot of sheep, who has a lot of power, and he has a guest come over. And instead of taking one of his sheep, he looks at his neighbor who has one sheep and takes that sheep to kill it, to feed his guest. And David is frustrated and angry and says that man should be put into jail and repay 100 times of what he would owe. And Nathan goes, that man was you. You sinned against the Lord. You did something that was wrong. And so we ask the question, what happens when we experience the wrath of God? Do we run away? Do we go, oh, God needs to calm down, so I'll talk to him in a few months? Or do we immediately turn to him? Because David's response to Nathan, him being a king, could have said, oh, I'm going to kill Nathan. If Nathan is dead, then who else is going to know? But instead, David's immediately response to Nathan telling him that you sinned, you've done wrong, David goes, I have indeed sinned against the Lord. And he takes the consequences of his sins and he goes, I'm going to live through this. but I would rather have the presence of the Lord than this power, than this kingdom, than this royalty that I have. And we talked about in Psalms 51, right? Where he says, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit in me. It's a plea to God going, I know I messed up, but I'd rather have you and go through these consequences and go through these things than to have you and your presence leave me. And I debated talking about that sermon, last week's sermon, and replacing with this week's sermon because this week I'm talking about the different types of wrath. Because the question I'm asking is, what or how is God's wrath seen? I think sometimes we get stuck in the idea that God's wrath is one thing only, and it's complete destruction. I think we get that into our mind. I have a story I want to tell you. I'm going to try to tell you the best that I can because I'm trying to remember how it went. But I was scrolling through my social media and a bunch of reels and watching short videos, and a video came up, and it was a software company. And the manager came up to these employees, and the deadline was a week away, and the manager said, "Hey, we got a week till the deadline. Is this going to be done? We can't have any more pushbacks. We have a deadline that needs to be met." And so the manager goes up to these two individuals working in a certain department, and they go, "Are you ready for next week?" But the two guys reluctantly bring up that due to setbacks, they're at least 5 weeks away from actually launching the program. The manager, out of frustration, says, "Well, you will have to go tell the boss that you're behind because I'm not going to go take that heat. I'm not going to go experience the boss's wrath." And so these two individuals who just got ringed out by their manager are like, "Well, we got to go tell the boss this situation that we're 5 weeks away from launch when they need to launch next week." And so as they're kind of walking, they're talking out loud, and another worker from another department, maybe from the debugging department, comes up and goes, "I hear you guys said we're 5 weeks behind." And well, I'm actually part of the debugging team, and we're not 5 weeks behind, we're 15 weeks behind. And so the original two people go, "Well, good luck, go tell the boss this. I'm not going to tell him that. I don't want his wrath." And so this new person was like, "Well, now I got to deal with what potentially might happen if I tell the boss that we're 15 weeks from release." And as he's walking towards the boss's office, another worker comes up to him and he goes, "I overheard you said we're 15 weeks away from launch. I'm part of the coding team, but I don't want to tell you how far we're behind, so I'm just going to let you go." Right? And so I tell that story only because, are we afraid of what God's wrath might look like? Are we afraid of what God might say or might do when we come to him when we've sinned? When we've done things that are wrong? Because just like the story, no one at that moment in time knew exactly what the wrath might look like from the boss. They just knew that they didn't want to experience it. And so they try to pass the blame to someone else or just not think about it or not be a part of it. And I think sometimes our idea of wrath is that God is just going to smite us. And so I don't want to come to a God who's going to pour his wrath onto me. And so a quick question for you is does not knowing how God might react to our sin cause us to not want to communicate or talk to God until we feel he's cooled off? It's the same way probably when we do something wrong, right? When we know we've done something wrong, we've messed up, and we don't want to face the person that we've done wrong to. I remember growing up and pausing before I would do something and weighing the consequences, right? If I did this, is it a spank on the bum or is this a grounding, right? Like you're weighing the options of like, is it worth it? Or is the consequences outdoing it? It's weighing the outcome versus the spoils of what I'm about to do. I would think to myself that if I would go through with what I'm planning on doing, then the results might be tolerable. The results might be manageable. Or the result might be more groundbreaking, right? Something that would be far more worse than I could imagine. And so I don't want to go into details of what I did, but I did something when I was younger that was really dumb. And I thought it would just be the normal spank, sent to your room situation. I didn't weigh the fact that there was a different type of punishment. I didn't weigh the fact that there was a different wrath that my mom and my dad could do to me. And so I did this horrible thing, and then I got caught, and my parents, instead of the usual spank and sent to your room, they said, "You're grounded from TV for a year." And I was like, "I did not ever encounter what TV? No, right?" My little brain could not comprehend that was a punishment that was available. But a whole year without TV made me rethink the next time I did something that maybe I shouldn't do it. So, was the wrath worth it? To me, losing a year of TV, it wasn't worth it, right? But I learned from that and going, well, maybe my actions actually do have consequences. Maybe the wrath actually has a purpose behind it. I don't want to say, I don't want to say my parents had wrath, but the punishment, right? There was purpose behind the wrath or purpose behind the punishment. It wasn't just because I was a little kid being stupid, right? Because, I have kids, and they do a lot of things because they're learning. And it's like, oh, man, if only you just get it the first time. But by God's grace, we learn from the things that I don't want to say the wrath, but at the same time, I do want to say the wrath. From the wrath that we experience. And so the wrath subjects that I'm about to discuss, it's not about the value of each punishment or the severity of each category that we'll talk about, okay? That's not the point of seeing how far you can push the guardrail. That's not what I'm talking about. The whole entire premise of this is that we will face things in life that will either pull or push us away from God, but sometimes there's a severity factor to it. If God wants us to stop doing what we're doing, it determines what's it going to do to our life. Depends, I think, how he's going to act. So God's wrath is the necessary, deliberate response of a holy God to sin in his creation. I think this is the next slide, Jill. Go next. All right, go back. Sorry. And this is just something I want you guys to read or maybe write down. But so when I said God's wrath is a necessary, deliberate response of a holy God to a sin in his creation, ways that we might feel God's anger against the sin we are residing with. Okay? I'm going to say that again. The ways that we might feel God's anger against the sin we are residing with. The sin we are residing with. The sin we are choosing to live with. Okay? And so this is God's judgment, God's anger against the sin that we are choosing to walk alongside. The sin that we're choosing to replace God with. And so the next slide here, this is the first one I found in the Bible. It's called the wrath of abandonment. And simply, I think it says under there, simply put, God removes his restraining grace and allows individuals or societies to experience the full destructive consequences of their sinful desires and choices, essentially letting them have what they want. The next slide is Romans chapter 1, verses 24 to 32. And it's interesting that Paul writes this about the Romans, but it very much hits us today. And this is what he says, therefore God gave them up into their lusts, in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For the women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They are filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. So God removes his restraining grace and allows individuals or societies to experience their consequences. And so you find a societal moral chaos begins to erupt when God leaves us to our own devices. I was thinking about this, like, do you guys remember, like, I mean, in the 90s, like, at least I watched movies from when we were younger. And so we've watched shows from the 90s. And we consider those movies or the shows to be relatively tame. And it's crazy because in the 90s, sometimes they do a risky move. They say a word they shouldn't say, or they do something provocative on the movie. But considered to the standards of the 90s versus the standards of today's movies, you have like PG-13 movies with F-bombs in it, right? You have nudity in PG-13 movies. Like, where did the standards go? What happened suddenly? Like, that's just a small example, but you have that all through society. What was considered like relatively tame 20 years ago, now we just have a full-blown craziness going on in our society. But you have that even in politics, right? How far can we push the line? How far can how close can we get to the guardrail? But then you get to the guardrail and then you go, well, that wasn't too bad. Let's move the guardrail. And then let's see how close we can get to that guardrail. And then you get close to that guardrail and go, well, let's just move the guardrail a little bit more. And the boundaries keep moving and moving and moving. But God's law, right? Like when you come down to, like, I don't want to say like murder, but that's for instance comes to mind, right? God says, don't murder. Okay, well, I won't murder, but how close can I get to pummeling someone before they're almost dead? But they're not dead, so Lord, I didn't kill them, right? But isn't that kind of where society has been going, right? How far away can we go but still look like we're okay? When society moves from merely committing sins to actively promoting and celebrating them, I think something has gone wrong. And so the wrath of abandonment, although it doesn't sound horrible, I kind of would rather have God in charge than myself. Right? It feels like God had a plan. God has laws in place for a reason. And when we disregard that, it's chaos. And so I absolutely believe that the wrath of abandonment is very much a real thing. God goes, okay, fine, you don't want to listen to me, do your thing. It doesn't mean that God abandons them forever because, right, if you think about the Israelites all through the Old Testament, right, they wanted to do things like the other nations. And God says, fine, be like the other nations. And then what happens? They get attacked. They get in trouble. Things go wrong. And then they cry out to God, and God hears their cry and goes, okay, I'm going to send you, specifically in Judges, I'll send you a judge. And the judge will lead you for years. And then the judge dies, and then Israel's like, oh, the judge is gone. Okay, let's go do stuff again. And they do more stuff. They do stupidity. And then they go, oh, Lord, we really messed up. The other people are attacking us. Please save us. And God goes, okay, I'll save you. Here's another judge, right? It doesn't mean that God abandons you forever, but you get a taste of what it's like when we're not letting God be in control. The further we move from God, the further down the hole we move, and we wonder why society is falling apart. The next slide is another one. The wrath of consequences, reaping what you sow. It's almost kind of, it feels like abandonment, but this is kind of where the story of David comes into. And so I have this, the wrath of consequences is God allowing humanity to face the natural, destructive consequences of their own choices and rejection of his principles. I think this is where the story of David from last week comes in, right? David messed up, right? He took Bathsheba from Uriah, had Uriah killed, and he was doing all these things. And then when Nathan came to him and he says, everything that you did in private, right, having someone murdered, taking someone that wasn't your wife, all that stuff is now going to be public and it's to be done by your kids, and nothing is going to be hidden in secret anymore. It's a consequence to his actions. And we see that quite a bit, is that we literally reap what we sow, or sow what we reap. The next slide is Galatians chapter 6, verses 7 to 8, and it says, "And they shall reap the whirlwind." And this verse often refers to God's wrath, where the consequences are far greater than the initial sinful action. The next slide is Proverbs chapter 22, verse 8. "Whoever sows injustice will reap calamity, and the rod of his fury will fail." And so rather than just active fire and brimstone that we think God might do to someone, this one's often viewed as a passive judgment that God allows humanity to face the natural destructive consequences of our own choices, right? If we think about addiction and self-destruction, right? The widespread destruction caused by drug abuse, pornography, rampant greed causes painful consequences of living outside of God's design, right? You get addicted to these drugs. The drugs take a toll on your health. It ruins relationships. Pornography ruins marriages. Alcoholism, you spend all your money on that. People don't want to be around you. You go to sleazy bars, all that stuff, right? It's the consequences to your actions. It doesn't mean that you can't come out the other side and look to God and change your life around, but you still got to live with some of those consequences, right? You can get diseases from doing drugs and sleeping around and all that, and you can still turn your life to God, but you still live with those consequences from those actions. Right? Digital reputation on social media. Many of you guys don't have social media, which is great. I don't recommend having it. It's good and it's bad. But a lot of people become keyboard warriors behind the screen, right? They start to say stuff they would never say in public. They make other people angry. They mock people, harass, and spread lies around to people. And what happens when you do that? No one trusts you. And nothing stays hidden on the internet. Your boss might find it. You lose a job. And then you try to get another job later on, but they look at your social media and go, wow, this guy looks like he parties too much, or this guy has caused a lot of issues before. You can still turn to God, but you still have to face those consequences of your actions. Right? I mean, the list can go on and on, right? Health consequences, when you abuse your body with substances and everything, you can turn to lifelong issues you have to deal with. This wrath that we're talking about, that God allows us to go through, is not a means for you to suffer, right? In the sense of suffering for eternity, abandoned from God in these moments. It's for him to go, your sin is not worth it. The sin that you're trying to hold on to is not worth it. It's destroying your body. It's destroying your relationships. It's causing us not to have this relationship. And so God is just going, it's like, don't you get it? It's not worth it. And I firmly believe that God hates watching us live in this sin. And he just wants us to get rid of it. But of course, due to free will, it's our choice. The next one is cataclysmic wrath. And you guys might guess what cataclysmic is. Direct intervention by God to punish sin. We read a lot of these in the very beginning of the Bible, right? We have the global flood. I think the next slide shows 3 examples, right? We have the global flood in Genesis 6-9. God was like, why did I create humanity? All right, he sends a flood. Then we have Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19, and he sends fire and brimstone. Like, this is the little moment of fire and brimstone. He destroys a city. And then we have the 10 plagues on Egypt in Exodus 7-12. Now, for cataclysmic wrath, church, I don't want you to go around and look at every natural disaster that is going on in this world and go, whoa, God's wrath is just tearing the earth apart. I'm not saying to go and look at that and go, God is wreaking havoc on everyone that's getting hit by a tornado or a hurricane or forest fires or floods. I don't want you guys to go look at that. That's not the point of that. But there is something that I have noticed, that every time someone goes through a cataclysmic event, what do you guys notice? You see it in movies and TV shows quite a bit, but real life people say it as well. when they're going through a tornado, they're hunkering in their basement, what do? Regardless if they're a believer or not, they pray, right? God, if you show up in this moment, if you get me through this tornado, if you get me through this disaster, what do they say? I'll go to church every Sunday, right? I'll start praying. I'll give back to the poor. I'll do all this stuff, right? In immediate disasters, regardless if they believe in God or not, they're praying to God. So many out of desperation cry out to God. And so when the disaster's over, some keep their word and some go, whew, that's my own doing, and they keep doing their own thing. But sometimes these moments turn us away, or turn us towards God. We see it as a second chance to go, okay, God, I get it. My life that I'm living now is not worth it. Like if I was to die, what would my legacy be? I'm not saying that I've gone through cataclysmic events like that, but I've been in car accidents and in those moments, after the car accident and getting out of the hospital and everything, I go, whew, I should kind of change how I'm living. I remember my first car accident I went through. I remember it's a small change. It sounds really weird, but I was listening to all those really, I won't say really bad, but bad songs on the radio, and I would listen to it all and I'd crank the music and think it's really great. But after my first accident, that changed. I didn't want to listen to that anymore. I instead listened to worship music, and it would change my attitude. It would change how I viewed things. And so I'm not saying that sometimes you'll have this immediate epiphany or light after disaster, but sometimes it changes us when we go through a moment where our life is threatened. And so there's moments of God's wrath where he goes, you need a hard slap across the face to get your attention because everything else isn't working. And so sometimes that works. The next one I have for wrath, I call it the hardening of hearts. And I simply put, this involves God strengthening a heart in the direction it has already chosen to go, confirming a person in their own rebellion. And now, to be fair, I'm going to talk about Pharaoh, because that's probably the most famous verse of hardening of the hearts. Pharaoh probably could have went under every category of wrath. I think Pharaoh went through every category that I'm going to talk about wrath. And so, if we have this idea, right, involves God strengthening a heart in the direction that is already chosen to go. Okay, you got to keep that in mind. And so Pharaoh in Exodus chapter 5 to 14, right, Israel has been enslaved for generations, and God sends Moses to Pharaoh with a clear command, let my people go. What does Pharaoh do? He refuses. He refuses again and again. And so God sends plagues, right? Cataclysmic event. He sends plagues, warnings, and undeniable signs that God is in control. And so this isn't just a political showdown, it's a spiritual one on Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh isn't only resisting Moses, he's resisting God. And so here's the part I think most people miss, that before the Bible ever says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, it repeatedly says that Pharaoh hardened his own. You can read it in Exodus chapter 8, verse 15, chapter 8, verse 32, and chapter 9, verse 34. Pharaoh already had his mind set. And so Pharaoh, he sees these miracles and he doubles down, right? I mean, your whole water system turned to blood. If that doesn't get your attention, I don't know what would, right? When giant locusts suddenly arrive and eat all your crops, that would get my attention. When your cattle start dying, that would get my attention. When people start getting boils, that would get my attention. And of course, the last plague, the firstborn of everyone without the blood on the door, would pass away. You would think that he would go, yeah, okay, God, I get what you're saying. Just leave. Take Moses is going to take everyone, they can go. But you notice that every time a plague happened, Pharaoh would relent under the pressure, but then he would change his mind as soon as the plague lifted. So when Scripture says that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, it's not God forcing evil onto an innocent man. It's God confirming Pharaoh in the rebellion he already chose. At a certain point, judgment looks like God removing restraint and giving you over to your own stubbornness. And here's a warning. Every human will glorify God somehow, either by surrender or being an example of what pride produces. Pharaoh's rebellion still ended up serving God's purpose because God used it to display his power, God used it to free his people, and God made it to make his name known. One of the greatest countries, one of the greatest nations in the world, Egypt, decimated. So the real question isn't, will God be glorified? The question is, will it be through your obedience or your resistance? Sounds absolutely crazy. But I also think this is very much one that we can see, hardening of our hearts. That no matter what God does, no matter what God will do, no matter what God shows, if we made our decision, if we made the choice, we're not going to see God. We're going to see what we want to see. And you can see this if you watch debates between Christian theologians and atheists, right? Christians can provide all the evidence that you can. But we know that the Holy Spirit has to take that evidence, has to take that word, and has to work on the heart of the one receiving it. But usually, most times, the atheist hearing it doesn't change their mind in these debates. Because they've chosen their path. They've chosen what how they will live. But there are good examples, right? Lee Strobel wrote the book, The Case for Christ, right? He was an atheist, and he's like, you know what? People talk about this Jesus character all the time. Let's go research him. Let's find the evidence. And through all of his research and through all of the evidence that he found, there was no deniability that he could find that Jesus existed and that he very much spoke the truth, right? And so Lee Strobel is one of the most famous Christians and theological speakers that you can find around, right? So it's not saying that your heart can't change, but if your heart's already hard, you have to make that choice to turn. So that one is hardening of the hearts. This last one I want to talk about is the eschatological, these are big words today for some reason, eschatological or final wrath. And I did, cool. Okay, the future final and eternal judgment of unrepentant sinners at the end of the age, which is described in the book of Revelation, is often termed as separation from God. Now you might go, well, what kind of wrath is that? Church, like David, when he sinned and he spent 9 months in what I would say is torture away from God, that was 9 months, and David was like, I can't do this anymore. I need your presence. Can you imagine that in the end times when we're standing before the great white throne and the Lamb's Book of Life is open and Jesus looks at you and he goes, depart from me, I've never known for you. Like that chills me when I say that, because that's eternal separation. That means there's no more chance for you to go, okay, God, I think you're kind of right. No, that time is over. And God says, you had all these opportunities, all these moments to see who I am, and now you're separated from me. And they talk about the lake of fire, right? And people are like, well, I don't want to go to hell because I imagine I'm going to be burning for eternity. I don't want to say that is the worst thing. The worst thing is that you're no longer in the presence of the Lord. You have no more opportunity to be in the presence of the Lord. You're away from that. And I think you are going to feel that. I know people will feel that. And so the next slide is Revelation chapter 20, verse 11. It says, then I saw a great white throne and him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. No one is escaping this. The next one is Revelations chapter 20, verse 15. A few verses later it says, and if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. The ultimate wrath. And so, church, reading all these lists of different wraths, I think the question out of all of this is not, I even wrote a piece of paper on it. The question for wrath is not, woe is me. The question is, what is God trying to get your attention? What is God trying to get you to turn from? What is God trying to show you that is ruining your life? Like, have you guys ever had those moments, we call them dry seasons, where we feel like God is not talking, right? What if that's moments where we have a wrath of abandonment because we've placed sin higher than God? And God's like, I've tried to get your attention and you're just not getting it. So if you want to live that life, okay, I'm stepping back. Right? What is God trying to get your attention from? And the more that I read about wrath, the more, right, we went through just 4 or 5 different wraths that we can find in the Bible. But the more that I read this, the more that I go, whoa, God, thank you that you are slow to anger. Thank you that your grace abounds, because I deserve the harshest punishment. And if your grace ever left me, I don't know what I would do. And so we're living in a time right now where I think people are taking the wrong advantage, where God's grace is abounding because of what Jesus did on the cross, that we have the reality that we can just ask God for forgiveness, the fact that we can just come to him at any moment, when we're walking down the street, when we're sitting in church, when we're sitting at home, when we're driving in the car, we have the opportunity to come to him. We don't have to do sacrifices anymore. We don't have to do this ritual process to get God's attention, but we do this and then live in active sin as if we have this freedom to do it because, grace. But there's going to come a point when grace is no longer available, that you're going to have to stand before the Lord and you're going to have to account for all the actions that you've done, the way that you've lived. And so in this very moment, thank the Lord that he is slow to anger and steadfast in his love, because as I talked last week, I deserve every punishment that he owes or that I've done. But by his grace, Jesus, by his stripes, took all of that. But we just have to acknowledge it. We have to accept Christ into our hearts for that. I'm going to end it here for now, because you guys are just overloaded with stuff, and I'm sorry for that. But I don't want you guys going home really defeated and feeling like God's wrath is on you. That's not the point. The point is just to go, I think I'm missing God. I think I'm away from his presence too long, and I think we need to have a David moment where we just got to go, yeah, I've sinned, and I got to come back to the presence of the Lord, that the things that I'm chasing are not worth the exile from his presence. And so we're going to take communion, and it's just an opportunity for us to check our hearts, right? To go, God, am I holding on to sin that I'm placing above you, that I think is better for me than you? And if there is something in my heart that I need to let go, can you reveal it to me? Can you help me to release it? Can you, I don't want to say show me that it's not worth it, but kind of do. God, show me that this sin isn't worth it. And so communion is for everyone. You guys have heard this spiel a few times, but if you don't want to take it, don't take it. If you don't take communion, it doesn't mean that you don't get to talk to God anymore. Still, even if you don't take communion, just you got to get back in a relationship with him. You got to have that communication with him. You got to rebuild that relationship. Because what if some of us are waiting for God to cool off before we talk to him? But God's already cooled off because he loves you. He created you. And he wants you to let go of this sin. He just wants you to run to him. And so I'll let you sit again, Gary. If you're, unless you want to, but another holiday.
Thank you.
You're a little tricky to get out.